Beautiful London town, as you can see.
Sorry,
you know
too
it's
big
London
enough
because of the door. Nobody has doors like that in America. Um,
Where it is actually Monday afternoon for us. So it still feels a little bit like Monday morning, but it's Monday afternoon. That's full stop.
this is a celebratory occasion because literally moments ago, Jenny and I put the final touches, the finishing touches. We dotted the I's, we crossed the T's, we put the little thingy on the
I was
Žižek.
gonna say.
We finished the new ebook. The ebook is called Where Nothing is Lacking, 5 Keys to Understanding Žižek. I'm very proud of it. I'm very pleased to have finished it. And right after the class finishes, we're going to be posting that. So if you'd like to download the new ebook, you can find that on Patreon. It is a 100-page, slightly under 100-page introduction to some of the more difficult ideas that Žižek has about Lacan and Hegel and Marx. And if you'd like to read that book, all you have to do is sign up to the Patreon, where you can download that book later today. Plus, we still have a promotion, which is that...
For 1 more hour during this class, we have the old
Well, and
ebook.
after the class. Until we post
Until
the new
we
book.
post the new book. The old ebook is still available. The Vanishing Mediator will vanish as soon as the new book is
We've made this really confusing. We're not good at marketing. We don't do marketing. Basically, I'm not criticizing you. This is my own problem. Basically, what we're trying to say is that if you sign up today, you can get 2 ebooks for the price of 1. You can get both the Vanishing Mediator and the new book, which is called Where Nothing is Lacking. It's my introduction to Žižek, and you can enjoy them both. Anyway, we're just not good at this.
I'm not good. We're not natural marketers, but
No.
we see those of you joining us are letting us know where you're coming in from. So hello to Lviv. We are in London, as Julian mentioned. We're going to be here for a little bit longer. So let us know where you are watching us from, joining us from, because it really is special thinking about the ways in which this is a global learning community. Yeah, it means a lot to us.
That's very true. And a big thank you to those of you who already downloaded both, already got the previous book. And yes, Jenline's absolutely right. The fact that we get to do this in so many different places, the fact that we get to connect with you guys around the world. For example, somebody just commented from Brooklyn, and we were just in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago. So thank you very much for posting where you're joining us from. I see Israel, Greece, Iran, Chicago. It really makes me very happy, and I don't just say that, like it's very true. Okay, so what are we going to do in this class? This is going to be a little bit like a book launch class. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to give you a condensed version of the book that's going to be released today on Patreon, Where Nothing is Lacking, 5 Keys to Understanding Žižek. And basically, I'm just going to talk you through what the book's about, how the chapters are structured, the ideas that I've put in the book, and hopefully that way, either you will be interested in purchasing the book, or if you cannot or don't want to purchase the book, you feel like you've had a little bit of a summary of what the book's about. You've sort of downloaded that information into your brain. And thank you again for posting where you're joining us from. It's totally mind-blowing, like all the places that are coming in. Also, a big thank you to Jenline, who continues to edit the transcripts and manage the Patreon, and the person who really keeps this project spiritually alive. I really appreciate that. Before we start, I also want to point out that the apartment that we're staying in, even though it's in London, has a giant poster of the Eiffel Tower, which is really, really horrific. And every time I see it, it reminds me of the story of, I don't know who it was. I don't know which painter it would have been. It couldn't have been Rodin. But the French artist who said that every morning he would go to have coffee and a pastry underneath the Eiffel Tower, because underneath the Eiffel Tower was the one place where he didn't have to see the Eiffel Tower, which I thought was quite nice. Anyway, I have nothing against the Eiffel Tower as such. I just think it's funny that there's an Eiffel Tower poster in our London apartment, truly proving once again that the grass on the other side of the channel is greener. Okay, so let's just dive right in right now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because you have a subtitle for this book that
Yeah.
you haven't used in the lectures.
Yeah, so the subtitle for this book is 5 Keys to Understanding Žižek. And what I wanted to do was that I really wanted to hopefully make this text and this book that's coming out today feel valuable to you, to be something that would hopefully help you. And it's really quite tricky to think to yourself, like, where would you start with Žižek? Because one of the things that Slavoj Žižek does is that he's famously associative. Like, he's constantly stringing together different ideas, different examples from different movies. I think we're back now. Žižek is constantly stringing together different ideas from movies and pop culture and philosophy and psychoanalysis. And because Žižek's books tend to be very long, it can feel like there's this enormous mountain you have to climb in order to access some of his more difficult ideas. And whilst it can be very fun to listen to Žižek lectures or to read his books, sometimes, and at least it's something that I used to experience, sometimes you're left with the sensation that you thought you understood everything, and yet at the end of the day, you struggle to remember what it was that was exactly being said. Now, this isn't a criticism of Žižek. This is also a stylistic feature of what you might call dialectical thought and dialectical style. It's the idea that rather than relaying a direct transfer of information, you have a kind of almost hysterical bouncing around between ideas. The idea being that you can constantly find more and new ways to infuse and bring your thought alive with examples. Žižek says that his overarching goal is to be as clear as possible, not to be too jargon heavy and not to be too abstract. And the way in which he does that is by trying to make his books and his ideas accessible through the use of jokes and references to films, etc. And so what I've tried to do, and maybe this is a crime, like maybe this is very bad, but I basically said, well, what if we took all the fun things out? Like, which isn't to say that I didn't want the book to be fun, but I said, what if we just sort of boil it down to the most important ideas? Like, what are the 5 insights that you need that will help you enjoy and understand Žižek's writing and teaching better?
Well, and especially if you're ascending to some of his more popular writing to his more difficult writing.
Yeah. Exactly. And so what I've basically done is that I've tried to, in the book, I've basically structured it in 5 chapters, and I've tried to structure it according to 5 kind of seemingly obvious questions that yet have surprisingly complicated and revealing answers. Basically what I do is I talk about his most well-known books, and I simply ask the question, what does the title mean? Because all of Žižek's titles seem to be fairly cryptic. For example, you could go all the way back to Žižek's PhD thesis, which was published as a book in French and then translated into English, which is called The Most Sublime Hysteric. Well, chapter 1 of my book is simply to say, who is the most sublime hysteric and why? Then Žižek's most well-known book is probably the sublime object of ideology. And so in my book I say, what is the sublime object of ideology? Because you could read the entire book that Žižek has and still be puzzled what the sublime object of ideology is, because he doesn't say it in a straightforward manner. The 3rd chapter of my book talks about Žižek's 2nd book, which is the ticklish subject. Strictly speaking, it's not his 2nd book, but it's like the spiritual successor to the sublime object of ideology. And again, I do the basic same procedure, which is to say, who or what is tickling the ticklish subject, and so on and so forth. And so basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take what seems to be obvious, which is, what is the meaning of Žižek's idea? What are some of his key takeaways from his books? And I'm trying to put that together. And along the way, the goal of the book is to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the key concepts within Lacanian psychoanalysis, like the difference between the little other and the big other, why the objet petit a is a reference to the objet petit autre, the little other, the idea of the Kantian sublime, the idea of Hegelian reflexive determination versus Marxist determinate reflection, and so on and so forth. So basically, I'm trying to give you some of the key ingredients that will hopefully make you feel a little bit more well-versed when you're reading Žižek as such. That's also why the goal isn't to tell you everything about Žižek, but it's to give you, and especially those of you who are already interested in Žižek, some of the keys that will help you unlock the next level of understanding Žižek. Because I think for a lot of people that can be frustrating, that you're enjoying Žižek, but then as soon as you're in conversation or you want to write about Žižek, you realize that on a more technical level, you're struggling to recreate what exactly it was that he was arguing. And I think that's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of discipline to really work through. And so I thought to myself, what I can do that is hopefully valuable to you is to take some of those more difficult ideas and condense them into a 100-page book. And that 100-page book is called Where Nothing is Lacking, 5 Keys to Understanding Žižek. and that's coming out today, if you didn't know, because I already mentioned that. Anyway, okay, so let's break that down real quick. I basically want to work through each of the chapters in a brief format. Is that okay? So it's a little bit different from our usual lectures. The first chapter is called The Most Sublime Hysteric. It's also called Who is the Most Sublime Hysteric? That's sort of how I've turned it into a question. And the most sublime hysteric, if you didn't know already, is simply how Lacan refers to Hegel. But it's also the title of Žižek's doctoral thesis. Now, Žižek had 2 PhD theses because the first thesis, his first doctorate, was rejected because it wasn't considered sufficiently Marxist. Which may be surprising because if you think about Žižek, you think of his association with leftist thought, even with communism, and certainly with the idea of Marxism. Žižek himself has said that his overarching aim is precisely to rehabilitate dialectical materialism, which is another way of saying something terribly taboo, which is to go back to a kind of Stalinist thought almost. Now, of course, dialectical materialism isn't Stalin's thought himself. It goes back to Engels and Marx, etc. Now, Žižek's second PhD thesis does what he couldn't do in the first. Remember, in the first PhD thesis, it wasn't considered Marxist enough. Now, why was Žižek's PhD thesis not considered sufficiently Marxist? Simply put, because he wanted to fuse psychoanalysis, specifically Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is another way of saying more radical Freudian psychoanalysis, with Marxism through Hegelian idealism. Now, if that's a lot of jargon, basically what Žižek is trying to do is he's trying to take an entire school of thought, which is Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he's trying to take those concepts in isolation and say, what if we read Hegel according to those concepts, and what if this new kind of Hegel, this Hegel that we've seen through the lens of Lacan, reveals new truths about Marxism, about Marx. And you can imagine that for an orthodox Marxist at the time, this would have been not something you could do, certainly not a PhD thesis. Of course, Žižek's second PhD thesis was precisely this project. And if you're curious about that project, you can buy it. There is literally a book called The Most Sublime Hysteric, in which you have a published and condensed version of what that doctoral thesis looked like. And interestingly enough, the ideas that he puts forth in that thesis are essentially the same ideas that he holds today, these same ideas that he's elaborated upon in 50 books. It's simply different ways of going over the same idea, the same fundamental intellectual project, which is to take Lacanian psychoanalysis, apply it to Hegel, and use that new psychoanalyzed Hegel to reframe Marxism and to rehabilitate dialectical materialism. I've said this many times before, but it's a good starting point.
Yeah, and that also gets back to what you talked about in this series, which was what are the ways in which Žižek is a kind of strange Marxist. He sort of embraces this label that Peterson has of him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the strange Marxism was in the famously lukewarm debate between Peterson and Žižek, in which Peterson said to Žižek, you know, you're a strange Marxist, and Žižek says, exactly, that's what I am. In fact, you probably could have, the book that I'm releasing today, instead of calling it Where Nothing is Lacking, which is sort of a slightly pretentious theoretical title, I could have just called it Strange Marxist. It probably would have sold better, you know, I mean, whatever, but Strange Marxist. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of the most sublime hysteric. When Lacan says that Hegel is the most sublime hysteric, he's actually making an argument that cuts right to the core of what Žižek is interested in. But in order to understand that, you have to break it up into two things, two ideas, the sublime and the hysteric. And in a nutshell, we already have here like a miniature version of Žižek's philosophical project, which is that the idea of a sublime hysteric combines what is a metaphysical philosophical idea, the sublime, with a psychoanalytic concept, namely that of hysteria. And so the title itself is quite beautiful because it contains within itself everything that you would need to know about what Žižek is interested in. And so what is the sublime? Well, the sublime, from a Kantian perspective, which is different from a Burkean perspective, can be explained in a fairly easy way. Of course, if you've studied Kant, you'll immediately say that this is too easy, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that the sublime is a kind of fruitful failure For example, we experience the sublime in art. When we write a poem, we're not just trying to express how we feel. When you write a poem, you're trying to express that which cannot be expressed. In a sense, the poem is a marker of an emotion that cannot be expressed in ordinary language. The same is true for a painting. A painting isn't necessarily an expression of an idea that you have or who you are or some hidden trauma. A painting fundamentally is trying to figurate, to paint something that cannot be expressed simply through the seeing eye, the way in which you relate to it. And for Kant, this is true for the relationship of man to God. Kant says that we can't know God. And so we find instances in which we feel close to God. But in a sense, we're not close to God. We're just aware of the sublime nature of our distance from God. Consider, for example, English Romanticism. We have this figure, this sort of Byron-esque figure standing in front of a storm, like the Turner paintings. Of course, the storm isn't a literal depiction of God's wrath. Instead, the storm is a depiction of the way in which we cannot grasp the full chaos and splendor and beauty of nature in its direct form. That in the entire chaos of what it means to be in the natural world, we feel very small. We're outside spectators. If you're looking for a pretty good definition of the sublime, you can look towards the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, in which the character of Michelle Yeoh says, the one thing we know for certain is that there will be more scientific discoveries. And those scientific discoveries will make us feel like even smaller pieces of shit. That is the Kantian sublime. It's the idea that the more access you have to the scale and the scope of that which is unknowable, the smaller we feel in comparison. And for Kant, from a theological perspective, this is the dialectic of presence and absence, that it's precisely in the moments in which we become radically aware of how far away we are from God that we feel closest to God, that God exists in this kind of sublime absence. And so what Kant is essentially saying is that the sublime is a marker of failure. It's a figuration of failure. It's a fruitful failure. And we can inhabit that through art, but in a sense we inhabit it through life itself. That the whole point of being alive is that we don't ever really feel like we're inhabiting our life properly, that we feel at a remove or at a distance to what it means to be alive, and that we're lucky if we have little moments in which we feel like we've tapped into the true nature of what life is all about, and yet those moments are fleeting. Now, when I said that the Kantian sublime is not the Burkean sublime, you have to understand that Burke basically thought that there are things that we can measure and there are things that we can't measure. For example, according to Burke, beauty can be measured. Something can be more or less beautiful. And yet the sublime is that which defies the idea of measurement itself. It's a little bit like the Kierkegaard, I think it's Kierkegaard, the Kierkegaardian expression that talent is being really good at hitting a target. And genius is being able to hit a target no one else can see. I didn't say it properly, but it's basically that, right? Mm-hmm. And so for Burke, there's something similar, which is that beauty is something that looks really good. And the sublime is something that defies beauty itself. Now, there's a certain truth to this, of course, as well, from a Kantian perspective, which is that sublime is something that goes beyond the ordinary limits of measure. It's the internal limit of measure itself. The sublime is that which exceeds measure, and it becomes a marker of it. When we're confronted with the sublime, we're confronted with the fact that there are things that remain outside the realm of that which can properly be made measurable. This is also why the word sublime relates to the idea of sublimation. The idea of sublimation relates to the word transcendence, the idea that there's an ideal or an upper notion, something higher or beyond our own selves. Now, I want to go back to the question we're trying to answer, which is, why does Lacan refer to Hegel as the most sublime hysteric? Well, we've already talked about what the sublime is, so let's put that aside for a moment. And now let's talk about what hysteria is for Lacan. And then we can take those two concepts together and you'll see what they mean. For Lacan, hysteria is essentially the opposite of psychosis. Psychosis is when you're stuck in a fantasy, when everything is too complete. And what's key for Lacan is that within psychosis, even your questioning of it can be integrated into the psychosis. In this sense, someone who's paranoid can also be psychotic. Someone who sees meaning in everything. Everything is connected. You put red strings all over your apartment. The very fact that you question everything means that the universal is precisely that everything is questionable. This is also why Susan Sontag said that she wished you were a paranoiac, because at least for paranoiacs, everything happens for a reason. And the problem of being alive is precisely that nothing seems to happen for a reason. Everything is random and pointless. Now, Sartre has a really, to my mind, a funny anecdote about psychosis, where he talks about a woman who goes to a psychoanalyst, and she says that she keeps getting phone calls from God. And the psychoanalyst tells the woman, you can't receive phone calls from God. God doesn't exist, so he can't be calling you. And the woman's response is really beautiful here, and it's really important if you want to understand psychosis. She says, I know God doesn't exist, but why does he keep calling me? In other words, I know perfectly well that there is no God, and yet somehow he's the one who doesn't know. This also goes back to Voltaire's idea, when Voltaire said that if there wasn't a God, it would be necessary to invent one. You could also relate it back to Lacan's accusation apropos the existentialists, when he said that they may have declared the death of God, but they forgot to tell God. But what's important here from when you think about psychosis is that her disbelief in God is precisely woven into the fabric of the psychotic experience. It's I'm being called by God even though I don't believe in him. It's not I'm being called by God because I believe in God. It's my disbelief is factored in to the belief itself. That which is supposed to exceed the closed structure of psychosis becomes woven back into it. Now, keep that thought in mind, because we'll come back to it, because it relates back to Lacan's idea about the universal and difference, etc. We'll come back to it. Hysteria is the opposite of psychosis. If psychosis is a system in which everything fits, even your own disbelief becomes part of the believing, then hysteria is a kind of hysterical scratching. It's like an unraveling, a questioning of the way in which meaning is generated around you. One of the classic definitions of hysteria is the shockingly simple and yet very dangerous question, do you love me? Which can be made even more dangerous by saying, do you really love me? Because of course, love is something that can't be measured, right? We're back at the idea of the sublime. Love is a kind of fruitful failure to explain what it is that you love about something, what makes somebody lovable. Of course, you can say something like, I like your smile, or I like the shape of your earlobes, or I like the way in which, we both laugh at the same jokes in a movie. Those are expressions of love, and yet fundamentally we can't say what love is. You go back to the idea of a sonnet. This is one of Shakespeare's famous sonnets, again, the sublime element of love, when he says that love is that which cannot be spoken out loud. He said in a sonnet, right? Of course, you could read a sonnet. Oh, sorry. And so love inhabits that sublime and yet somewhat uncanny space, which is that love is a marker for that which cannot be formalized. Everybody knows, pop psychology, love is something that you have to constantly repeat. Love is simply an act of repetition. It's saying, I'm going to find new ways to demonstrate and to share my love with you every single day. And so hysteria is a radical questioning of that which cannot be formalized. It could be the question, do you really love me? Well, prove it to me. It could be making a little test for your partner. But hysteria could also be, what do I mean to other people? What do they mean to me? What is my true self? What is my purpose? What is my nature? Those are all hysterical questions. Now, it's important to say from a historical perspective, mind you, that hysteria has often been used as a way to marginalize and dismiss the very legitimate concerns of women who were oppressed within the household, let alone within the public sphere. That hysteria was often used as a way to misdiagnose or refuse to diagnose legitimate ailments that especially women and minorities experience within society. Oh, she's just being hysterical, right? It's a sexist trope that continues today. And yet, for Lacan and Freud, hysteria has nothing to do with a normative dismissal of complaints. Instead, hysteria is almost a positive feature, because to be hysterical is to question your surroundings and your relationship to others. It's one of the first and elementary procedures of psychoanalysis is precisely to induce hysteria within the psychotic subject. To say that you have to question the way in which your imaginary self relates to your symbolic self, which is another way of saying the way in which the supposed completeness of your being relates to the supposed incompleteness of everybody else, the way in which other people don't appear real to us, and yet somehow we think they have it more figured out than we do. That there's a fundamental disconnect between who we are and who we'd like to be, but also who we think other people are and who we'd like them to be. And so that you have to learn to give up on some of those illusions. It's what Lacan calls traversing the fantasy. But that starts, of course, with a kind of hysterical questioning. And so Lacan, once again, says that Hegel is the most sublime hysteric. Now, we've defined two of these central ideas. Sublime, hysteric. Sublime, that which cannot be formalized, that which is a formal marker of its own lack of formal content, which is a very fancy way of saying that it is a sign of its own inability to be a sign. Adorno argued that societies are sublime, that the definition of a healthy and thriving society is precisely a space in which you cannot agree upon what that society is and what it means. This is also the idea of cultural hegemony within Gramsci, the idea that revolution isn't saying we're going to get rid of the president. Revolution is saying we're going to continue to reframe the coordinates by which we navigate what we find to be ethically and morally sound within our society. That's a kind of hegemony, and that's a cultural battle. And so the sublime is a marker of that which cannot be formalized. In the same way that a love song is the truest expression of love that you cannot express to the person except through what is a fruitful failure to express it. That is the sublime. Hysteria is the questioning of that which appears to be complete, that which appears to be tautological, that which doesn't seem to succumb to this inner tension of the sublime, something that doesn't need to be figurated, a love that is so pure that you would never have to express it, for example. And so when Lacan says that Hegel is the most sublime hysteric, he's making both a metaphysical and a psychoanalytic argument, and here's why. Kantian transcendentalism, the so-called Kantian turn, is a relatively simple argument if you boil it down. Remember, Hegel is simply continuing what Kant already did. Hegel's also continuing what Fichte did, because Kant basically threw down the gauntlet. Kant said, if the traditional metaphysical divide, the idealism of Plato, is about the separation between essence and appearance, between the world of truth and the world of illusion, then what are the conditions for me, the subject, to access the absolute? After all, if Plato threw down the original gauntlet, which was to say you have to exit the cave, you have to exit the world of appearance and enter into the world of truth, Kant says, well, how do we enter into the world of truth? We have to enter it through reason. And yet for Kant, reason is itself the barrier towards that kind of truth. If you look at the title of Kant's most famous book, it's precisely looking into the conditions, the critique of pure reason. Can there be such a thing as pure reason? Can reason be a reflection of the absolute, and can reason access the absolute? Kant's answer is essentially no. Kant has the famous idea of the antinomies, the idea that there are barriers within reason itself, that objects may have essence, the famous Ding an sich, and that we can't access that essence through subjective reason, that there can be no such thing as pure reason as such. And so what I've tried to argue is that Kant is like the lady who's being called by God, which is the lady goes to the shrink, to the psychoanalyst, and says, why is God calling me? I know he doesn't exist. Kant does something very similar, but almost in reverse. Kant says, why are the Ding an sich, why are the objects on themselves, why is the absolute knocking at my door when I know that my reason can't access them? In other words, what Kant is essentially saying is that reason cannot access the absolute, and yet the absolute remains behind the door of reason. Kant says, I can't get there, but I know it is there. What Hegel essentially does is he hystericizes the Kantian insight, the so-called Kantian turn. Because what Hegel says is this barrier that you've put forth, this barrier of subjective reason, this door behind which the absolute is supposedly hid. What if this barrier is itself the only way in which the absolute is made manifest? What if there's no absolute behind the antinomies? What if the antinomies contain within themselves the absolute? In other words, Hegel's making an argument very similar to the Sublime. What if true love is precisely the sonnet? What if the truth of the human experience is precisely the failure to express what it means to be alive? What if the truth of God is precisely within the absence of God? What if in the dialectic of presence and absence, the absence is what makes presence manifest? And so what Hegel essentially does is he posits a kind of sublime within the Kantian transcendental edifice itself, which is to say, what if there's no sublime behind the antinomies? What if the antinomies are themselves the sublime? What if they are themselves the absolute? What if the absolute is only retroactively generated through the fall into subjective reason itself? What if pure reason is precisely the impurity of reason? That's what Hegel's trying to argue. And what Hegel thereby does is Hegel hystericizes the Kantian turn. If the Kantian turn is simply to focus on subjectivity, the conditions required for the idea of pure reason, then Hegel goes a step further and says, what if there is no such thing as purity behind reason? What if this radical questioning, the impossibility and the failure of reason to access the absolute, is the only way in which the absolute is formalized? What if that is essence? And then what Hegel does, and this is the key part, I really think this is like kind of beautiful, is that Hegel takes this hysteria and absolutizes it. In other words, Hegel is the most sublime hysteric precisely because he says, what if this kind of radical impossibility of reaching the absolute, the finite, particular, subjective being, what if that is the only way in which the absolute or essence is made manifest? In other words, he takes hysterical questioning, which is supposed to be the clawing away at the facade of psychosis, and he says, what if this is precisely itself absolute? And so rather than saying that Hegel doesn't believe in the absolute, rather than saying I've undermined the absolute and clearly we only have the existentialist world of becoming, in a weird way, Hegel upholds the idea of the absolute precisely by absolutizing the non-absolute, by absolutizing the hysterical undermining of the idea of the absolute itself. This is very similar to the Lacanian idea where Lacan says that the only universal is difference as such. In other words, we don't have the universal here and the particular here, the all and the non-all. Instead, the only thing that is all is the non-all. The only thing that is all is difference as such. And so when Lacan says that Hegel is the most sublime hysteric, what he's essentially arguing is that he's not just the sublime hysteric. In other words, he's not just like hystericizing the idea of the sublime in relation to the absolute. He's actually raising hysteria to the level of the absolute itself, which is something that only Hegel does. Now, this is where Žižek comes in, because the traditional analysis of Hegel is to say, well, Hegel is a mystical thinker in which everything is subsumed into this kind of solipsistic system of the absolute. Everything you do, everything you feel, everything that is within subjectivity becomes part of the deterministic unfolding of the absolute. And Zizek's argument, which I've tried to lay out in the book, is simply to say, wait a minute, this doesn't recognize the fundamental insight that Hegel has, which is that there is no absolute out there into which the particular is subsumed. The idea of sublimation isn't the process by which the individual particular finite being transcends into a higher realm. If you think that's Hegel, then you didn't need Hegel. In a weird way, you're back with Kant almost. Instead, what Hegel is essentially arguing is that the absolute is the fall of the absolute, that the absolute functions as a kind of sublime. And what is the sublime of the absolute is precisely subjectivity. It's Hegel's famous aphorism that subject equals substance. That the subject is the sublime marker of the fruitful impossibility of the absolute. And that the truest reflection of the absolute occurs precisely within subjectivity itself. Now, this is, oh, we lost the connection briefly. This is admittedly a little bit confusing, so let's make the leap, but hold that thought. Let's make the leap into the second part. So this was basically chapter 1 of my book, already 30 minutes. It's just a bit of a summary. Chapter 2 of the book is titled, What is the Sublime Object of Ideology? Now, Žižek's most famous book, the book that's probably most well known, is The Sublime Object of Ideology. And yet you could read the entire book and still wonder to yourself, what is the sublime object of ideology? Now, it helps that at this point we already know what the sublime is. And I'm going to give you the answer, but it's going to be very unsatisfying. This is kind of like a game that I play throughout the entire book, which is that I give you an answer, but it basically means nothing until you've explained it. So what is the sublime object of ideology? The answer for Žižek, he says this in an interview somewhere, is money. The sublime object of ideology is money. Okay, great. What does that mean? Like, it doesn't really do anything for you. The sublime object of ideology is money. Okay, so now we have to break it down again. What is ideology for Žižek, and what is the sublime object? So, and also, people in the comments are saying they want to read the book. We're going to be posting the book later today. So right after this class, we're going to make some final adjustments, and then Jenline's going to post the book.
Yeah, it's
today.
ready to be posted.
But if you want to if you want to get both books for the price of one, you can go to Patreon and you can download both of them if you want. Okay.
You can download the current one now, and then after the class, you can download the next one. But they will not be there simultaneously.
No, they will briefly for a brief period of time. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're right. Okay, so The Sublime Object of Ideology, Zizek's most famous book. And in an interview, he says, the sublime object of ideology is money. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. We don't think of Žižek as being like a person who writes books about money. So why is the sublime object of ideology money? Well, first of all, we have to break down the fundamental premises within the idea itself. Ideology and the idea of the sublime object. So, what is ideology according to Žižek? First of all, you've probably seen memes of Žižek putting on like the glasses of ideology where like he sees through things. This goes back to the idea that idea in ancient Greek is to see, and logos is a system. And so ideology, strictly speaking, is a system of seeing. It's the manner in which we see things. What that means on a very literal level is that when you look at the world around you, you infer meaning in a certain way. You attribute meaning to things according to what Frederick Jameson called like this entire system of mapping, the way in which you take all the knowledge that you have and all the awareness and perhaps also all your prejudices and you fill them in. You're stitching meaning into things. And so when we look at the world around us, we make sense of it. We understand it. We almost intuitively seem to know who people are, what they do, etc., whether it's class consciousness, not in a Marxist sense, but the awareness of class, whether it's simply being able to determine existing hierarchies, whether it's the expression of lifestyle. There are so many ways in which we interact in what Lacan calls the symbolic order that are relating back to this idea that we know how to see the world around us and to interpret it according to the various signs that are being sent out. And so what ideology does for Žižek is that ideology frames the way in which we see the world. It's the structure that fills in the manner in which meaning is created. Now, it's important to note that this goes against the common sense interpretation of ideology, the way in which you may have learned about ideology in school. In part, this is because Žižek's theory of ideology goes back to a lineage of German thinkers who write about the so-called critique of ideology, or Ideologiekritik. Arguably, this goes all the way back to Nietzsche, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so, the traditional common sense idea of ideology that you may have learned in school is that ideology functions almost as a kind of brainwashing, that it functions as
like political ideology.
Yeah,
You're somewhere on a spectrum. There's the right, there's the left, there's the realist, there's the liberal, there's the
Yeah, it's like choose your fighter, essentially. Like choose your type of ideology. And that the Enlightenment project, the project of the individual thinker, the enlightened mind, is to be free of ideology, to live in a supposedly non-ideological world.
Cast off the shackles of ideology.
Exactly, yeah. And first of all, one of the things that Žižek argues, and not just Žižek, is that the most ideological thing you could ever say or do is precisely to posit the exiting of ideology. That as soon as you're told that you're in a non-ideological space, you should be suspicious and aware of the fact that you are in the most ideological space there is. And in a weird way, we find here almost like a symptomatic, quote-unquote, return of the repressed. If you think about how sports stadiums in the United States were always promised as the one place in which politics don't matter, of course, it's precisely those places in which politics have come to matter more than perhaps in any other public places that we see in the United States. Although, strictly speaking, I suppose a sports arena is not exactly a public space. I mean, they're called things like, I don't know, like casinos.com, etc. But Zizek's idea about the critique of ideology can also be explained in a psychoanalytic sense, which can be put like this. Essentially, for Lacan, what structures subjectivity, in other words, the way in which you experience selfhood, is conditioned by desire. And that the one thing that we can't let go of is desire. That even the idea, perhaps the Buddhist idea that you would forego desire, is a kind of desire, a desire to forego desire. This is why Lacan says that even if you became a hermit who lived on top of a mountain, you wouldn't just have denied the body, you would have become denial embodied. That we cannot let go of subjectivity as a kind of physical marker of incompleteness. And that if desire structures subjectivity, then Zizek's question is simply, well, what structures desire? That's the fundamental question as to the critique of ideology for Zizek. What structures desire? How is desire filled in? And it's really important to note here that it's not about a shadowy, overarching figure, a corporation or a politician who is manufacturing desire. It's not about a secretive organization that is telling you what to want and what to think. Instead, it's almost the exact opposite. If we exist because we desire, then the thing that we fear the most is losing our desire. And so we have to act as if there were an overarching, shadowy reason or figure that makes us desire. Because the thing that we fear the most is precisely our loss of desire, which would be synonymous with our loss of self. As I said in the class last week, this is why Lacan says that you are your own symptom. You're not expressing your true self. You're doing everything to avoid the truth that there is no true self. And within that kind of hysterical flailing, subjectivity emerges. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself here because we're still talking about the sublime object of ideology. But if ideology is that which structures desire, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, how is desire structured? Desire is structured in our relationship to objects. We desire things, or we desire people, or we desire nourishment. We desire what Lacan would call an other. And the way that we can continue to desire is, of course, by means of exchange. This is where we make a leap towards Marx. Remember, for Marx, money is actually a surprisingly utopian feature. Money is a sublime object for Marx. Why is that? We don't think of Marx as being pro-money necessarily. We have this very false stereotypical idea that leftists all want to live in poverty, etc. I like that quote about leftism is, it's not to say we want to abolish first class. Instead, it's saying we want to abolish second class. Everything should be first class.
Well, and it's not about eradicating markets. It's about eradicating exploitation. And those are two very, very different things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so for Marx, money is actually a kind of utopian feature because within the world that Marx lives in, which is sort of the master-slave world of master-slave bondage, money allows you to act as if you were a lord, to essentially interact with others on a level that goes beyond your station. But it's more than that, because that would be a bit vulgar. It's also specifically that money has no originating value. In other words, money doesn't actually, and Jenny knows more about this than I do, but money is simply a fungibility, simply a token of the fungibility of value generated by the exchange of other things, which is a fancy way of saying that money enables us to exchange other goods as if they were equitable. And now we're back at Nietzsche's idea that I mentioned earlier, which is that Nietzsche has one of the first critiques of ideology when he says that the idea of ideology is simply das Gleichsetzen des Nichtgleichen, which is another way of saying to make equitable that which is not equitable, to make fungible that which is non-fungible. Strictly speaking, a sheep is a non-fungible token. You cannot exchange it for other things, except perhaps for another sheep. And as soon as we decide to trade sheep, or the wool of sheep, for some other good, the idea of a barter exchange, you have the problem of finding equivalent value. And what's so important for Marx is that there's no a priori equivalence in value. In fact, there is no such thing as a priori value in the first place. There is no true originating value to a commodity as such. In other words, a commodity isn't something you begin with. A commodity is what something looks like once you've attached value to it.
And can I just interrupt and just draw where the parallel is in the trajectory? Because I think it's really helpful to spell this out. And it's not always possible to do this in the classes.
Yeah.
But by doing this overview with the book, hopefully it becomes clear that the insight that Hegel has in terms of being, there is no absolute. It's just in the mediation that meaning arises.
Yeah.
We're seeing the exact same thing with Marx. It's
Yeah.
not that there's value behind the thing, it's in the mediation, it's in the exchange,
Right.
it's in the social relations. Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's
And
perfect.
that's also with the notion of ideology. It's not like there is some pure ideology, and if only we could reveal
Be rid of
the
ideology,
pure
yeah.
meaning, we could understand the world. No, if you see this pure meaning, it becomes incomprehensible. It has no meaning. It's devoid of meaning. So rather than saying ideology is what blinds us, ideology in this sense is actually what structures meaning. And it's not to say
What
that it's
fills
a
in
bad
meaning,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, it's what fills in meaning. And so it's important to recognize that it's not a normative judgment. We're not saying that's a good or a bad thing per se. But it's how do you become increasingly aware of
Yeah.
that dynamic.
Yeah, it's a super good point. Like, you're definitely like ahead of me, of course, in this, because I'm a bit slow, but you're exactly
No,
right.
no.
Which is, the linkages you're making are exactly the ones that I'm aiming at, which is that if for Marx, money is this thing, this physical marker of the exchange of goods and the necessity of having value to facilitate that exchange, then A, there is no underlying pure value. There is no value to begin with. And secondly, money is thereby a kind of sublime object, the sublime token that makes manifest that which wasn't originally there, which is value. And then you realize that in order to sustain that system, the structure in which value is continuously generated and sustained, as if it were a priori, you need ideology. And so we go back to what Žižek says, which is that ideology is what structures desire. And of course, Marx's critique of capitalism, that's been continued today, is precisely to say that where money was supposed to facilitate, where value was supposed to facilitate the exchange of goods, now the exchange of good is supposed to facilitate the continuation of value. And it's the world upside down.
And you can really, sorry to keep
Yeah,
interrupting,
yeah,
you
sure,
can
no,
really
no.
see that precisely whenever you're looking at ways in which products justify their value. So whether it's De Beers diamonds as like, diamonds are the ultimate romantic gesture, or cryptocurrency being, trying to self-justify why its value is inherent and beyond simple market exchange, that is precisely where you see the ideological influence.
Yeah, and that if you got rid of the ideology, you wouldn't go back to the originating value. The whole value system would crumble. And that's what revolution is. Revolution isn't saying let's go back to how things were when they were better. That would be a pseudo-revolution, a reactionary insurrection. Instead, revolution is simply the kind of insight that once you get rid of this ideology, then the entire system of meaning, the governing incentive structure itself crumbles and a new one has to be created. And so to go back to what I was trying to say, which is that when Žižek says the sublime object of ideology is nothing less and nothing more than money, that's what he means. Money is the token, the sublime object that facilitates the exchange of value as if it were a priori in goods. And in order to sustain that, you require ideology, that which structures desire and our participation in the world. And so that is why money equals the sublime object of ideology. Like, it's surprisingly, like, I don't know if anyone can follow this. I hope you can. I'm trying to be clear, is that it's a surprisingly simple idea once you lay out the pieces for it. And that's what I'm trying to do in my book. And that book is coming out today. This is a book launch, after all. So pretentious. You know, we never do stuff like this.
It makes me wish that we had like a little model cannon or something.
Yeah, like
We
a
could
little,
just-
like
like a little catapult.
like a little, yeah, exactly, or like a little table afterwards. And okay, so we've already answered two questions, which is why does Lacan, or who's the most sublime hysteric, and why does Lacan call Hegel the most sublime hysteric? We've answered the question, why is the most sublime object of ideology money? Not being very eloquent, sorry. I'm really bad at summarizing what I've already said. Editorializing, as they call it. And then chapter 3 of the book, this is like the most boring way to like discuss a book, but I hope it works as a lecture, is Zizek's sort of spiritual sequel to the sublime object of ideology is the Ticklish subject. And essentially, what I tried to answer in the book, Žižek has answered this somewhere himself, is to say, well, who or what tickles the ticklish subjects? Let's break that down. I'll try to be a little bit more quick this time. Who or what tickles the ticklish subject? The answer, once again, is surprisingly simple. So simple that it becomes seemingly nonsensical. What tickles the ticklish subject? Well, it's the objet petit a. It is the object, cause, or desire. And so essentially, the subject is tickled by desire. That's the plain answer. And yet, as per usual with these answers,
we can slam the book closed.
we can slam the book closed. Well,
we
that
can all walk away.
yeah.
Yeah, because no one reads the Agatha Christie mystery novels to know who did it.
Yeah.
They want to know how the crime was committed.
Oh, that's very nice. I like
right?
that. That's excellent. That's very, very good. And yeah, okay, so let's talk a little bit about that for a moment, because it'll give you a little introduction to some of the Lacanian ideas. So first of all, what is the difference between the objet petit a and you could say the big other, the grand A? The objet petit a is the little other, right? A is simply the marker for other, for autre. Now, the objet petit a exists on the level of the imaginary. The objet, okay, let's just say big other because it sounds dumb otherwise. The big other and the little other. The little other exists on the level of the imaginary. The big other exists on the level of the symbolic. Now, the imaginary, for Lacan, is the way in which we relate to ourselves. We have an imaginary relationship to the idea of our own selfhood, and we hold on to it. We really cling to it. The symbolic is how we participate with others. The symbolic order is what sustains our relationship to others in the world. This is also about what Hegel called Sittlichkeit, or what today we would call politesse. Part of being in the world is that you know the boundaries and the unspoken rules of it. If you go into a coffee shop and someone says, "How are you?" and you tell them, "Well, actually, I'm having a terrible day because I had panic attacks during the night, and in the morning my fridge was empty," and you go on this whole thing, they'll look at you like you're crazy. Because the whole point was that you were feigning intimacy, "How are you?" so as to keep people away, right? You were essentially saying, I am feigning interest in your life so that you will understand that the polite thing to do is to feign interest in mine, and then we never have to actually really be interested in each other's lives. And this isn't a bad thing. Again, I think that the worst thing is this sort of like pseudo-romantic idea that we should go back to authentic expression of self. The idea that when you go out into the world, people should hug you and actually cry on your shoulder and tell you how they really feel. No,
Especially if you're the next person in coffee line.
Yeah. No, one of the civilizing gestures is precisely that we can withhold our own subjective being from others. Vice versa, part of growing up is also that you have to learn to withhold your subjective being from some of the people closest to you, like your parents, in order to survive in the world and not constantly go back to them. Okay. And so the symbolic order sustains our participation in the world, which vice versa sustains our imaginary relationship with ourselves. Anecdotal evidence. As a college student, I once managed not to leave my room for 4 consecutive days. I had not spoken with anyone. I had become, as Lacan put it, denial embodied. And when I went out into the world and had to actually open my mouth and speak for the first time after this period of extended personal isolation, I found that I struggled to speak. Like suddenly language seemed like alien to me. Now, this is an extreme version of the fact that if you live in the imaginary alone, you live only within yourself, you lose access to the symbolic, which sustains the imaginary. Part of the dreadful torment of solitary isolation within the prison system is precisely that you become detached from the symbolic order, which leads you to becoming detached from your own self. But what Lacan argues, and this is one of those classic Lacanian ideas, fairly well known, is that the big other doesn't exist. That there is no overarching figure or agency or institution, what Althusser calls ISA, ideological state apparati, that is structuring how you interact with the world. There's no center in which people decide what is considered polite and impolite. Instead, what creates it is precisely this participation of people who don't really know how to participate. This has been one of the most discombobulating part of, for Jenlene and me traveling, is that in the era of the pandemic, in the era of COVID, every country and every city has adapted differently. And there's different cultural attitudes towards mask wearing and towards social distancing. And you may think that you're doing what everybody does, but suddenly you're in a different city and people have different practices. This is only one example of that. I feel like I'm futzing my hair a lot. Jenlene usually cuts my hair, and I had a haircut here, and I think it's terrible. I really hate it. I want Jenlene to cut my hair again. It just looks so bad. Okay. And the point being here is that when Lacan says that there is no big other, it's not to say that there is no big other, so we might as well all just, go around and party and run around naked because the parents aren't home. Instead, it's precisely because there is no big other that it's up to us to act as if there were. That's what's so crucial here. This is also, again, how ideology functions for Žižek. Ideology isn't to say there's an overarching process, some person or figure or institution that tells you how to act and how to think. It's precisely that there is no overarching institution. That means that we all have to figure it out ourselves, and so we create institutions and cultural societies, etc., etc. It all goes back to the Kantian idea of ethics and morality, which is that we don't know what God wants from us, and so we have to figure out what we think God would find befitting of him, which means that we have to come up with these elaborate ideas of ethics and morality that relate to how we think one might live accordingly to a world in which there were a God. And so this kind of, again, hysterical relationship towards the big other, which is what does the big other want from me, is sustained despite and precisely because the big other is not there. We're back at this kind of psychotic relationship of God is calling me even though I know God doesn't exist. We have to continue acting as if there were a big other precisely because there is no big other.
And this was always one of the things that I think really cracked us up when we were in university and worked as university educators, because there is often a suspicion of academics brainwashing their students and convincing them of all of these, leftist ideas. Oh, yeah. And the reality is, professors can't get their students to do anything. Like, if we could actually control our students in any kind of meaningful way, we would get them to do the reading, and that was often a struggle. And it's precisely because there is no big other, because there is no overarching structure, that students are in a new environment and they're around new people and new ideas and new cultures and
That's what's
new
scary.
experiences, and that's what's scary. And so they're having to create their own ideological framework to make sense of all of these things that they previously had not had to grapple with.
It's
whether
really-
it's having roommates or
It's a really good point that you make, which is that what frightens, let's say, conservative parents about university isn't that their children are going to be told what to think. It's that they're not going to be told what to think. That's what's
Yeah.
frightening, right?
yeah.
And so we have that reversal again. So Lacan essentially posits that we're stuck between. Also, we're just going to go long because this class is already 60 minutes. We're just going to go extra today.
We know we were a bit late.
Lacan essentially, no, we've done 60 minutes. Yeah, I'm just going to keep going. Thank you for being here, by the way. I know this is very fun for me, so thank you. This is still our book launch. This is an explanation of the book. You won't have to read the book after listening to this. It's perfect. Not only have I written the book for you, I've also explained it so you never have to touch it. So I'm doing you a favor. Lacan basically says that subjectivity emerges within the crack of the imaginary and the symbolic. In other words, within the symbolic order, in which we're all acting as if there is a big other, precisely because there is none, and within the imaginary, in which we're all acting as if there is a true self, precisely because we don't have a true self. And so we're kind of like hysterically flailing in both directions, and that is the real of subjectivity, a real that we have to constantly keep at bay so as not to have a psychotic break. And that successful process of keeping that reality away is what subjectivity is. This is what Lacan calls the split subject. The split subject being marked by an S with like a line through it, which is also, again, simply Lacan's pun, an adaptation of Freud. Freud's idea is that the subject is the subject of the unconscious, not the subconscious, because the subconscious is the... we dropped on YouTube. So Freud says that there is no subconscious, there's only unconscious. Now, what is the...
Subconscious for Freud is like that Hegelian, there is no world of absolute, or the ideological...
I'll try to be as clear
go
as
for it.
possible, and this is also in the book. So one of the key insights of psychoanalysis is that there is no subconscious, there's only unconscious. And that what we consider to be subjectivity is the subject of the unconscious. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the idea of the subconscious is very much like a Victorian idea, that you have this clean slate of authentic subjectivity that cannot be tarnished by the urges and impulses of your inner demons, that a successful gentleman or gentlewoman is someone who is in control of their impulses. This is like the classic Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, right? You don't want to succumb to being Mr. Hyde, you want to remain Dr. Jekyll. Where we see a slightly more Freudian theory of the unconscious is actually in the first Avengers movie. The last Avengers movie? I don't know. One of the Avengers movies, in which the Hulk, it's the last one. Mm-hmm. The Hulk has figured out how to no longer succumb to his rage. He is a well-adjusted green Hulk who is polite and nice. And at a certain point, he's asked, why are you no longer angry, Hulk? Why don't you become angry? And Hulk has a very beautiful Freudian answer. He simply says, oh, it's not that I'm not angry. It's that I'm angry all the time. And that's exactly, again, the universalization of difference. It's not to say that you suppress one part so that you have a healthy thing. It's that the universalization of the repressed becomes you. That's the Freudian unconscious. The Freudian unconscious is to say there is no clean slate or no fortress of self that you have to guard from corruption. Instead, the self is simply the very uncanny retroactive eminence of repression itself. Okay. More about that in the book. We don't have to go all the way there. But Lacan says that the subject is the subject of the unconscious. Now, Freud says that the subject of the unconscious in German is wo es war, soll ich werden. Where it was, I will become. In other words, there was no originating a priori subjectivity or self. That is a retroactive illusion that you require in order to cope with the much more horrific nihilistic idea that there is nothing underneath the surface. As Lacan puts it, that there is no true or real you behind the mask, that the real you is your mask. Moreover, that the fake you is yourself, your true self. That is the only way in which essence emerges through appearance itself. Now, the pun that I alluded to is that when Freud says, wo es war, soll ich werden, you can already hear the phonetic, wo es war, soll ich werden. Ich is I. And so Lacan just basically plays around. Again, this is the fraudulent aspect of Lacan in a very fun way, is that we go from es to ich, from es to I. And so for Lacan, the subject that is both es, it, and I, ich, is precisely the letter S with the stripe, with the line between it. Does that ever make sense that people aren't German? Yeah, okay. It's a
kind of. I mean, it took me a little while.
It's a phonetic joke, basically. In German, it is S. And for Lacan, subject, which is supposed to be the opposite of it, is S. The whole thing is whatever. Whatever. I think it's funny, but that's just me. Okay. So we're still talking about who or what tickles the ticklish subject. Now, we've already said that the ticklish subject is tickled by desire, by the objet PTA, by the object cause of desire. And the object cause of desire only takes place within the overarching structure, the umbrella of the big other. Now, what is the object cause of desire? Well, the object cause of desire is what allows us to keep on desiring. Lacan has a very sexist image that he uses to illustrate this. He talks about a ballerina on stage, and he says, what makes the ballerina desirable? It's not her poise, it's not her grace, it's not her credentials as an artist, it's not her gender, her sex. It's the spotlight. For Lacan, the ballerina may well be the object of desire, but the spotlight is the object cause of desire. In other words, the spotlight is what illuminates that which can be desirable. And again, it's not to say that the spotlight or the person operating the spotlight has a secret agenda to make us want to desire that at which he points the spotlight. Instead, the spotlight creates the structural conditions for our desire to emerge and take place. And the only way in which the structural conditions of that desire can match the object of desire, in other words, the spotlight on the ballerina, is the overarching cupola, the big other, of the theater itself, of the exchange with other people in which we know what a ballerina is in the first place and why she might appear desirable to us. And so this is essentially what Lacan is positing, that in order for the object of desire to be desirable, it requires an object cause of desire, which is the objet petit a, which is the little other, which itself stands in relation to the big other, which creates the overarching conditions of desire itself. And so if you wanted to create like a linear structure, you would have here the idea of the big other, within which we have the structuring conditions of the little other, and within that you have the object of desire. And now, through my visualization, you can understand why Žižek uses the image of the Kinder egg, the German surprise Kinder egg, as an illustration of this. The Kinder egg has a wrapping in which you have chocolate, in which you have a toy. You think that what you want is the toy, the ballerina, but instead you want the toy because of the chocolate, which is the object cause of desire. And yet, as soon as you have the toy, what you secretly want is the object cause of desire, which is the chocolate. You grab the toy and then you eat the chocolate and so on and so forth. You're stuck in a loop. This very loop retroactively generates the continuation of desire, which is what is required to facilitate the necessity of the big other. In other words, we require the big other, even though it doesn't exist, to sustain our desiring, which brings us back to the Lacanian maxim, what we desire is desire itself. That is what tickles the ticklish subject. It is not just the object of desire, nor is it just the object cause of desire. It's specifically the dialectical, hysterical relationship by which all of these things that don't exist by themselves are retroactively generated in order for us to sustain the sheer possibility of being alive as a person. Which, my dear friends, leads us to one of the final key insights for Žižek, which is that Žižek has always argued that if you want to understand his Marxism, all you have to do is understand one concept. This is a big class, by the way. One concept. And that one concept is the concept of death drive, or Todestrieb. Now, Todestrieb breaks down into two things, death and drive. Trieb for Freud and for Lacan is about the difference between something that is your goal and which is your aim. Your goal is what you want. Your aim is your underlying motive. Think about the Kinder egg. When you eat the Kinder egg, your goal is to have the chocolate, to have the toy. And yet your aim is to keep on wanting the next thing. The same is true with the death drive. If what we want is to keep on desiring, if we desire desire itself, then our goal is to achieve the object of desire, but our aim is to sustain desire itself. In other words, there's a tautological overlap in which satisfaction is achieved precisely by maintaining dissatisfaction. And so what appears to be the positive entity of satisfaction and the negative entity of dissatisfaction turn out to be one and the same thing, the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. We have here, again, the only universal is difference. These two things that appear to be antithetical, that appear to be exactly negations of each other, are in fact one and the same. The oneness emerges precisely by means of a fall into these two particulars. And when Žižek says that the death drive is what you have to understand if you want to understand his philosophy, he's saying that the death drive is precisely not a self-sabotaging urge. The death drive for Freud is not how we undermine ourselves. The death drive is the properly paradoxical condition by which we only live through the act of negation. In other words, that in this supposed metaphysical separation between being and becoming, we have not a static absolute of being and a particular finite substance of becoming, we have instead becoming as the negation of that which allows the absolute to emerge. I know that sounds incredibly technical, but think about it in easy terms. In order to survive, you have to live. In order to live, you have to eat. In order to eat, you have to consume. In order to be, you have to spend time. Like I've said this before, like we are nothing else than the transitory vessels of negation. We negate time, we negate resources, we negate attention. We negate until we negate no longer. And this is why for Freud, and again for Lacan, the link you have to make between the death drive, between the act, the paradoxical act of being alive by means of perpetual negation, is in the word perpetual, which is repetition. The two terms you have to know is death drive and what Freud calls Wiederholungszwang, which is the compulsion to repeat. This is the Nine Inch Nails song. I always forget what it is. Every day is exactly the same. The process of life, once you think about it, is the act of repetition, whether it's going to the bathroom, whether it's sleeping, whether it's doing more or less the same things every day in different forms. And what ideology does is it allows us to sustain this process of repetition by constantly giving us the appearance of something which is new. You go to Netflix and it's basically all pretty much the same movie, except with slight differences. I mean, there's a narrative structure and there's target demographics and whatnot, but when you watch a television series, you want every episode to be fundamentally the same, except with a slightly different varnish on it. And that's pleasurable. And this is also a coping mechanism for life itself. Life is the process of repetition. And so for Freud, the idea of being properly alive is essentially a neurotic experience by which you're constantly repeating the same things over and over, telling yourselves that this is the pursuit of something new. And that process of the death drive therefore relates to Zizek's theory of ideology. Because if ideology is what fills in our glasses, what infers meaning in how we interpret the world, and if the world is simply the act of repetition, which is another form of negation, then the way in which we take that negation through repetition and infer retroactive meaning to it, i.e. why we continue to do it, that is ideological. The way in which we sustain our drive. And so one of the key ideas for Žižek is taking the Freudian idea of drive, which is the separation of a goal and an aim, which relates to the idea of the death drive, which is the paradox of life lived as perpetual negation, which is related to the idea of the constant repetition of said negation, and to say that in order to stitch that together, you require ideology. And so now you can see in a nutshell how the ticklish subject, the subject who is tickled by the objet petit a, which in turn retroactively generates the idea of the big other, which allows us to sustain the imaginary relationship we have to ourselves and to the symbolic order in relationship to the object of desire, how that would relate to the sublime object of ideology. If we are stuck between being tickled by desire, which retroactively generates the entire edifice of the symbolic and the imaginary, the real which we try to repress, which is the real of the constant Todestrieb of repetition, if that has to be sustained through ideology, it has to be sustained through the sublime object of ideology, in other words, through value and the idea of money, the way in which we conceive of ourselves as a token of fungibility, the way in which we conceive of ourselves as something which moves forward in a perpetual kind of exchange. And this is one of the keys. Once you see that repetition can be made more interesting by the idea of exchange, we have a reason to keep on doing it. And this isn't just a critique of capitalism, this is a critique of the idea of drive itself. That we exchange our time for something, we exchange our attention for something, that love even is the exchange of focus and attention and time and spit with somebody else. And that the entire process of what it means to be alive is to be stuck in this kind of subjectivity that cannot find its true authentic being, and that sustains itself through a kind of necessarily incomplete, doomed to fail repetition, which can only be made to feel worthwhile in the idea of exchange. In the idea of exchange with somebody else who is exactly as pathetically lacking. Now we're at Lacan's theory of love. Lacan's theory of love is simply to give that what you don't have to somebody who doesn't want it. What I don't have is authentic subjectivity. The other person doesn't want my authentic subjectivity. They want to be authentic subjects themselves, and they think that I have access to it. And so it's within this incompleteness that we find completeness. Again, for Lacan, the only universal is difference as such. The truly universalized difference we find within love. And so we're back at the Kantian idea of the sublime. We're back at the Hegelian idea of the sublime hysteric. The idea that,
Make it.
right here, I'm losing charge. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that all these ideas connect. And if you would like to have a condensed version of these ideas, as small as I've been able to make it, because I really believe in the idea of density. I like Žižek's books that are really long, they're entertaining, but I also like the idea of squeezing it all together. If you would like to have the most condensed version of these arguments, which is who is the most sublime hysteric, what is the sublime object of ideology, who tickles the ticklish subject, what is the subject of the unconscious, and the one that I haven't addressed yet, which is what is less than nothing. You can find all of that. Not all of that and more, all of that.
And precisely that.
Precisely that. In my book that we're going to release today, it's going to be an ebook called Where Nothing is Lacking, 5 Keys to Understanding Žižek. And the one thing I haven't explained is what where nothing is lacking means. And so if you'd like to join us for a discussion on why it's called Where Nothing is Lacking, we're going to continue that on Discord.
Yes.
It's probably too exhausting for people. We'll see. Anyway, I want to say a very big thank you to all of our students from around the world,
Yes.
all of our global patrons, all of our participants in this learning community.
Yeah.
I love the fact that we can be unapologetically theoretical and just sort of crazy and dense, and we never have to explain ourselves. I really hope that this is valuable to you. I genuinely hope it is. And it makes me super happy when people read the book. So if you'd like to download the book, plus the other book, because I think we're doing like a 2 books for 1 kind of situation today. You can go to Patreon right now. Starts at $5, but goes up to $25. You can download all of our materials there. There's a link in my bio, or go to www.patreon.com/Gentleman and Julian. And I really, really hope you guys enjoy the new book. We've both worked really hard on it.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you have any questions, you can always join us on
Discord.
On Discord. We're going to be hosting another half-hour Q&A on Discord. So we're going to be going live in just a moment. Until then, thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Have a great week.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.